Hi, I'm Seabud, and welcome to the next tutorial in this series, in which we will take care of bringing textures on our modeled materials. So I've decided to make this part a bit different to the others and just present to you what my final result looks like, and then explain to you how I got there, because the process really can be quite repetitive and the rules in which the materials come together are really quite fixed, and so you can apply them more or less to all of your materials. So let's start by going into the shading tab, and let's click on our first material, which is the window frame material. And this one's the easiest. I've just plugged in a solid color into the shader and the base color like that. Make sure the material output is fed, and then I've adjusted the values for coat, glossiness, and I know that I want to have a mask here, so I've done that. Let's go to our next material, which is the plaster material of the walls. We still have the material output and the node group that we did in the last video, and we have 3 textures, which are the orange ones, and these are controlled by the red and purple nodes. So this is always the same structure. And if we take a look at our materials, we can see that we have 3 sort of concretey, noisy textures, and then we are combining them with all the yellow nodes in different ways, just so they look a bit more as we want it. And we also have a displacement node connected. So this one mainly takes care of displacing the material slightly in a certain direction, so that can be made use of for the height map to take a bit more control for that. Now for the glossiness, we are taking the last node, the last editing node before the shader, and we are just rearranging kind of the brightness with a color ramp node to be fitting more the range of colors that we want. So usually for most materials that's rather dark, so maybe 10 to 30% brightness, and then we plug that into the glossiness input. Here I've also put the coat value to 0.15. So we also have a material for the foundation. For this one we have quite the same structure of having our 2 nodes that take care of the output, and then we have the typical setup for projecting the image textures in the right way. And in the middle we are making our edits that then feed the shader and the outputs. So one difference that we have here that we don't have in the other materials, if we look through the 3 textures that we have, we can see that the first one is unwrapped in a slightly different way. It uses the UV output, and the other ones are more automatically projected with the object output. And this is just because I wanted a bit more control of placing the sort of grid character of the first texture. And then we can take a look at how we combine these 3 textures into our final product, which is quite the same way as we've done it in the other textures as well. And as in the other ones as well, we are using a color ramp to kind of shift our final color or texture in the right brightness, and then put it into the glossiness value of our output. With our metal coverings, we are using quite the same technique as for the foundation. So one of our textures is controlled by our manual UV placement, and the other one is controlled by an automatic object space placement. And these are our 2 textures which are being combined, and then I just adjust the values a bit for brightness and saturation and color, and that will be fed into the shader as well. And a little difference in this material is that I've used the output of one texture directly as our glossiness value, because the sort of reflections that are displayed on the first texture are not really something that's super realistic to have for glossiness. And so I just wanted a bit more of a evenly spaced or evenly displayed grain on the glossiness map. Now we are getting to a slightly more complicated setup for our roof tiles. So this one is slightly more advanced. We can see that we have different brightnesses for the different tiles, and we also have some stains which are located where the water runs down, so that is in the space between these little higher parts of the tiles, and this sort of runoff texture therefore has to be displayed only on the lowest parts of the material. Getting a different color per roof tile can be automated quite well by using a custom attribute. So that is this node, and I've called my attribute island ID that sits on the geometry. And if we go to the geometry nodes tab, we can see I've set up a really small geometry node script that I've applied on our tiles mesh. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking my mesh island, which is counting each tile because we've modeled them differently and then arrayed them. So I'm taking this sort of island ID or index, and I'm feeding that into the ID of the random value to then produce values between 0 and 1, and that simply gets fed into a store named attribute node to be able to reuse the attributes, and then it appears just like this in the attribute node in our shader editor. You can see this feeds into my general setup for distributing a noise texture, and if we zoom in we can see that the texture is a bit displaced, and without our custom attributes this would not be the case, so we wouldn't have these sort of slightly sharp edges appearing. And then I'll show you the textures that I'm using. So that is our runoff, little clay texture and an additional concrete texture, and just like in the other materials I'm sort of combining them together again here using the custom attribute, changing the color, changing the brightness, and afterwards I am also taking care of blending in this sort of runoff value. So for that I'm simply using a position node, and we know that we want only the lowest parts to appear, so we will use the Z coordinate and then arrange our map range in a way that only those lowest areas will be kind of transformed. And then with a map range node we can sort of push the right height into becoming the right values, and if we lighten our texture accordingly we can sort of blend out or disable the parts that we don't want to see. And this will be fed into a color ramp node and then combined with what we already have. And then afterwards, one more thing I'm doing is our random noise that we have generated. I am also shifting the values a bit and then just blending that with the texture and then producing the glossiness value from it and feeding it into the shader for our material outputs. The last texture is our sandstone material, and this one was probably the most complex one. So again, we are using a custom attribute that we are generating from a geometry nodes script. Again, here I want to get different values for the different bricks that are part of the mesh by mesh island, and I'm using that to displace the placement of the texture on the material so that we can get this nicely random noise effect. I'm also using a couple of other patterns that I blend in. And then this one is controlled by the UV, so I'm placing it manually. And here I've just combined all the UVs into one tiny space so that everything looks the same. And we are going to talk about that more in a minute. So as for all of the other materials, I'm combining the textures here so that they blend together and that I also have a lot of detail. And for the bricks, I wanted to get a bit of a special effect, which is to sort of brighten up the edges of the brick. And to do this, you need 2 bevel nodes and a difference, and then you can adjust the values with a color ramp, and then you just feed that into the texture. And when we hit render, we can see that it produces these sort of nice whitened up edges. For the sandstone, I'm also combining another noise texture with the final texture result just to add a bit more detail. And we are going to need this because we have quite a high texture resolution. So we want our texture to be nicely detailed and grained, and the noise texture helps with that. And that is pretty much it for the sandstone, except there's one more detail. So for the cornice that I've modeled previously, I wanted the texture to be a bit different, but I didn't want to create a new material for it. So this is where our customly unwrapped texture comes into play, which looks like this. So it's a bit of a dirt stain texture, and you can see how I have unwrapped this here manually. And for the main texture, or for the main part of the bricks, I've just put the scale to 0 to have one flat color, and that leads to the result of the texture only appearing on one part of the mesh. And for this one, I'm combining that into the other textures right at the end, and that way these sort of dirt stains appear really nicely. And that was it for the textures. It's a process that I would say needs a little bit of practice and a little bit of knowledge about the shader editor and how this sort of procedural texture editing works. But once you get the hang of it, it really is quite simple, and it really also offers a lot of possibilities for sort of manual or procedural editing of the textures. And you can of course also reuse material setups across projects really easily, which makes this quite a powerful feature, I would say. So that's it for the textures. And in the next part of the series, we will jump into the compositor to start combining our textures into a final product.